In this episode, we're going to connect two things that beginners often learn separately and never quite stitch together: how you analyze organizational risk and how you turn that analysis into sensible countermeasures, including compensating controls when the ideal fix is not possible. Risk analysis can feel like a math problem where you assign numbers and then move on, but the real point is decision-making, deciding what matters most, what could realistically go wrong, and what actions reduce harm in a way the organization can sustain. Countermeasures are simply the actions you take to reduce risk, and controls are the rules, processes, and mechanisms that make those actions reliable. Compensating controls are what you use when you cannot apply the preferred control, but you still need to reach an acceptable level of protection using alternate methods. By the end, you should be able to describe a plain language risk analysis approach and explain how to pick controls that match the risk instead of controls that merely look impressive. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To analyze organizational risk, you start by understanding that organizations face more than one kind of harm, and cybersecurity is only part of the story. Harm can show up as service disruption, financial loss, legal exposure, safety impact, reputational damage, and loss of strategic advantage, like losing intellectual property. Organizational risk analysis asks, what outcomes would be most damaging to this organization, and what could cause those outcomes? That question is broader than asking whether a server can be hacked, because sometimes the biggest risk is a process failure, a dependency failure, or a decision failure that creates exposure over time. For beginners, the simplest way to stay grounded is to think in terms of what the organization is trying to do, what must go right for that to happen, and what happens when those critical things go wrong. Once you see risk through the lens of outcomes and dependencies, you stop treating risk as a technical score and start treating it as a practical planning tool. A useful risk analysis step is to define the scope of what you are analyzing so you do not accidentally mix unrelated concerns. Scope can be a system, a business process, a program, or a set of related services, but it should be clear enough that you can name the assets involved and the people accountable. If your scope is too broad, you get vague conclusions like everything is risky, which helps nobody. If your scope is too narrow, you miss the context that creates real impact, like how a small system supports a critical workflow. In a beginner-friendly sense, scope is your boundary for what you will consider when you ask what could go wrong and what you will do about it. A good scope statement also makes it easier to compare risks across the organization because you are analyzing similar units in similar ways. After scope, risk analysis needs three core ingredients: assets and value, threats and events, and vulnerabilities and weaknesses. Assets and value tell you what matters and why, because without value you cannot judge impact. Threats and events describe what could happen, whether it is a malicious actor, a mistake, a failure, or a natural disruption. Vulnerabilities and weaknesses describe how the event could actually cause harm, like weak access control, poor monitoring, inadequate backup practices, or confusing processes that cause errors. Beginners sometimes assume vulnerabilities are only software bugs, but organizational vulnerabilities can be procedural, like unclear approval rules, or human, like lack of training for a critical task. Risk analysis is basically the story of value meeting a harmful event through a weakness that allows damage. When you can tell that story clearly, you can choose countermeasures that break the chain. Impact is the part of risk analysis that most clearly connects security to the business, and it should be described in concrete terms. Instead of saying a breach would be bad, you describe what would happen, like customers cannot access accounts for 2 days, payments cannot be processed, or sensitive records are exposed. You also consider second-order effects, such as regulatory reporting, contract penalties, and loss of trust, because those can dwarf the immediate technical harm. Even as a beginner, you can learn to ask impact questions that clarify the real stakes, such as who is affected, how many people are affected, and how long the organization can tolerate disruption. Impact assessment does not need perfect numbers to be useful, but it does need clear categories and a shared understanding of what high impact means in this organization. Without that shared understanding, different teams will label things high or low based on emotion instead of consistent reasoning. Likelihood is where beginners often get trapped because they assume you must predict the future precisely. In practice, likelihood is an estimate of how plausible an event is, given the environment, the exposure, and the weaknesses you know about. You can reason about likelihood by asking whether the asset is reachable, whether the weakness is common and easy to exploit, whether the organization has seen similar incidents, and whether controls already reduce the chance of success. You also consider the threat landscape in a general way, like whether a type of attack is common across many organizations, but you do not need to become a specialist in adversary groups to make useful judgments. The goal is not perfect prediction. The goal is making decisions that are defensible and consistent. If you can explain why you consider a scenario plausible or unlikely using observable factors, your analysis will be more trustworthy. Once you have a clear view of impact and likelihood, you can prioritize risks, and prioritization is where analysis turns into action. Prioritization does not mean you fix everything at once, because resources are always limited, and it is often impossible to remove all risk. Instead, you decide which risks are too large to accept and which ones can be tolerated with monitoring or planned improvement. This is where risk appetite and risk tolerance show up as boundaries that tell you when a risk must be treated and when it can be accepted. For example, an organization might tolerate some inconvenience risk in internal tools, but it might have almost no tolerance for risks involving certain sensitive data. Prioritization creates a short list of what you will address first, which is essential for choosing countermeasures effectively rather than spreading effort thinly across everything. Now we can talk about selecting countermeasures, and the first rule is that countermeasures should match the risk chain you identified. If the weakness is weak authentication, countermeasures should strengthen how identity is verified and how access is granted, not just add a new monitoring dashboard. If the problem is that backups cannot be restored reliably, the countermeasure is not just buying storage, it is improving recovery readiness and validation. Countermeasures can reduce risk by lowering likelihood, lowering impact, or both, and it helps beginners to name which one a given control is meant to influence. Some controls, like segmentation, aim to reduce impact by limiting spread. Others, like strong authentication and authorization, aim to reduce likelihood by making misuse harder. When you know which lever you are pulling, you can judge whether the control actually addresses the problem. Controls come in different flavors, and beginners should learn the idea of preventive, detective, and corrective controls because it clarifies how protection works over time. Preventive controls aim to stop the bad event from succeeding, like controlling access or blocking unsafe actions. Detective controls aim to notice something wrong quickly, like monitoring and alerting for unusual activity. Corrective controls aim to restore or contain after something happens, like recovery processes and incident response. Most organizations need a blend because prevention is never perfect, detection without response is just awareness, and correction without preparation becomes chaos. Selecting controls is partly about balancing these types so that a single failure does not become a catastrophe. A mature selection also considers that control effectiveness depends on how consistently it is operated, not just how good it looks on paper. A compensating control becomes relevant when the preferred control cannot be implemented due to constraints like legacy technology, business timing, contractual limits, or cost. The key idea is that a compensating control should provide comparable risk reduction, even if it works differently. It is not a loophole to accept unsafe conditions. It is a substitute that addresses the same risk outcome. For example, if you cannot implement a modern access mechanism on an older system, you might reduce exposure by limiting network reachability and tightening monitoring, combined with stricter administrative procedures. The goal is to change the risk equation so that the likelihood of misuse drops or the impact is constrained. For beginners, the important habit is to tie the compensating control back to the original risk story and explain how the substitute breaks the chain. To choose between countermeasures, you also consider feasibility and side effects, because controls can create friction, complexity, and new risks. A control that is too burdensome will be bypassed, and a control that is too complex may fail in ways nobody notices. This is why the best countermeasure is not always the strongest theoretical control. but the control that the organization can apply reliably and maintain. For instance, an extremely strict process that delays every change might reduce change-related risk, but increase operational risk by preventing timely fixes. Effective selection means you are looking for controls that fit the organization's capability and workflow, not just controls that sound rigorous. When a control changes behavior, you should consider what people will actually do under pressure, because that is when risk becomes real. Evidence of control effectiveness matters, even at a beginner level, because selection is not complete until you can explain how you will know the control works. A control is not effective just because it exists. It is effective when it consistently achieves the intended outcome. If you choose monitoring as a countermeasure, you need to know what signals will indicate trouble and what response will follow, or else monitoring becomes noise. If you choose a recovery-oriented countermeasure, you need to know how restoration will be validated, or else recovery becomes guesswork. Evidence can be as simple as documented procedures, recorded reviews, and demonstrated outcomes, but the mindset is what matters. We choose controls we can verify. This is especially important for compensating controls because they are often questioned later, and you need to show that the substitute actually reduced risk to an acceptable level. Another common beginner pitfall is selecting controls based only on a checklist rather than on the organization's specific risk profile. Checklists can be helpful as reminders, but they can also lead to control clutter, where many controls exist, but few are well operated. Control clutter creates a false sense of security and can even increase risk by overwhelming teams and hiding what truly matters. A risk-based selection approach asks which controls address the highest risks and which controls provide the most risk reduction per unit of effort and complexity. It also asks whether controls overlap in a useful way or whether they duplicate each other without adding real resilience. When you align controls to prioritized risks, you can explain the rationale, and you can adjust the set as risks change. To bring it all together, organizational risk analysis is a disciplined way of describing what matters, what could go wrong, how it could happen, and what the consequences would be, so that decisions are consistent and defensible. Countermeasures and controls are the actions and mechanisms you choose to reduce either the likelihood or the impact, ideally in a balanced way that includes prevention, detection, and correction. Compensating controls are substitutes used when preferred controls cannot be applied, and they must still tie back to the same risk chain and deliver comparable reduction. The core skill for a new learner is not memorizing control names, but learning how to reason from a risk story to a control choice that actually changes the outcome. When you can explain that reasoning clearly, you have moved from abstract risk talk to practical security decision-making that an organization can trust.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.